I feel bad that I haven't covered any fighting games on this channel until now. It's not that I have anything against fighting games, I assure you. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct, Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Marvel vs. Soul Calibur, they're all games I've played with friends every so often, or plop the occasional quarter into an arcade cabinet if I happen to come across one. At the very least, I respect them as pillars of the fighting game genre. It's just that fighting games have never been something I've particularly excelled at. To get really good at fighting games, you have to spend a lot of time practicing. And at my age, I don't really have the free time to devote to playing and getting really, really good at one single game anymore. Sure, I'm an expert at Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, but that's because it came out when I was 13 and I was able to play the game for hundreds of hours. Nowadays, that's definitely not the case. And yet, my completionist tendencies also mean I'm hesitant to buy or own games that I'm not confident I can complete to 100%. And so, even when a fighting game does catch my interest, I'm not very likely to pick one up. But, as with most things in my life, I'm always making an exception for Sonic. Not only is Sonic the Fighters the first fighting game I've covered on this channel, it's also the first 3D Sonic game I'm covering. Because it was the first 3D Sonic game, period. Sonic the Fighters was developed by Sega's AM2 division, arguably Sega's most prolific arcade dev team, responsible for such hits as Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, and Virtua Cop. If you've stepped foot into an arcade within the last 30 years, you're probably familiar with the work of Sega AM2. Interestingly enough, Sonic the Fighters was built off the same engine as another AM2 fighter, Fighting Vipers, with development starting largely as the result of a joke. While developing Fighting Vipers, programmer Masahiro Sugiyama, also responsible for the creation of the character Honey, created playable versions of Sonic and Tails in his free time, just to have some fun and mess around for a while. The code was crude and not completely finished, but this little pet project was enough to attract the attention of Yu Suzuki, head of the AM2 division, who shared it with fellow AM2 head Hiroshi Kataoka. The two were intrigued by the idea, but Kataoka in particular worried that Sonic Team perhaps wouldn't approve of a game where Sonic characters beat each other up. Much to their surprise, however, Yuji Naka loved the idea and gave the team his blessing to create a full Sonic fighting game. How uncharacteristically unpetty of the man. Sonic the Fighters was built off the Fighting Vipers engine, but with more simplified gameplay mechanics and a more stylized, cartoonish graphical style. The team did face some difficulty in bringing the Sonic characters into the world of 3D, though. After all, these characters had largely only been 2D up to this point. Luckily for AM2, Sonic Team had created physical 3D models of Sonic as reference way back when they were developing the first game, and Naka and the team were more than happy to loan this model to AM2 to serve as reference. A character from Fighting Vipers, the aforementioned Honey, was even reworked into Honey the Cat, although she wasn't made playable in the final game, and Yu Suzuki believes she was slipped in by Honey's original creator as a sort of calling card. The final roster would feature a total of 8 playable fighters. Sonic and Tails were of course the first to be included, but they were followed shortly after by Knuckles and Amy. As time went on, SBL and Fang would be added as well, joined by 2 new characters, Bark the Polar Bear and a woodpecker known as Bean the Dynamite. Yep, he's a woodpecker. Even though he's an homage to the game Dynamite Ducks, and even though he's a duck in the Archie comics, Sega told us after like 20 years that he's actually a woodpecker, so yeah. First Fang isn't actually a weasel, and now this. This is why you hire lore teams, Sega. The 2 new characters were apparently added at the request of Yuji Naka, and Yu Suzuki at one point joked that anyone who attempts to make a Sonic game has a duty to create at least one new character. The game does have a story, or at least just enough story to justify these characters suddenly beating the ever-loving crap out of one another. Dr. Eggman, or Dr. Robotonic as the Attract mode has it, has launched the Death Egg 2 into orbit, guarded by a newly upgraded Metal Sonic. Tails builds a rocket with which to reach the deadly satellite, but unfortunately it can only seat one person, and requires all 8, yes 8, Chaos Emeralds to power its flight. With the game's fighters already possessing 1 emerald each, they decide to hold a tournament to decide who will ultimately be sent to destroy the new Death Egg. The single-player arcade mode sees the player fighting against each of the 8 characters in a preset order, on stages either based on or inspired by existing Sonic levels. For example, there's South Island from Sonic 1, Casino Night from Sonic 2, and Mushroom Hill from Sonic & Knuckles. but also original stages such as Canyon Cruise or the Dynamite Plant. For matches where the player has to fight their own character, a mini cutscene precedes the fight which has Dr. Eggman showing up to clone the player's character into a grayscale copy. Each match consists of rounds of 30 seconds each, fought best 2 of 3, meaning a full playthrough of the game can be finished in around 10 or 15 minutes depending on the number of continues used. Upon defeating a character, either by scoring a KO or having more health than their opponent when the timer hits 0, the player wins the Chaos Emerald of their opponent's color and moves on to the next match. If the player manages to beat all 8 fighters, they then face Metal Sonic aboard the Death Egg 2, and if they're victorious, they're given one chance to defeat Dr. Eggman in 15 seconds or less before the Death Egg explodes. The credits only roll if Eggman is successfully KO'd, but whether they defeat Eggman or not, any player that defeated Metal Sonic will have their character and total playtime recorded on the cabinet's high score screen. Sonic the Fighters obviously runs on a heavily edited version of Fighting Vipers, which itself was basically a more simplified version of Virtua Fighter 2. 3 main buttons are used: punch, kick, and barrier, with combos performed largely by combinations or sequences of button presses and directional inputs, although there are a few joystick motions incorporated as well, such as half circles and dragon punches. Characters fight on a 2D plane but in a 3D arena, meaning movement is mainly done in 2 directions, although sidesteps can be performed for some light dodging or catching an opponent off guard. Certain heavy moves can also temporarily squish characters flat like a pancake, severely limiting their offensive options until they return to normal. Characters can even run up walls to perform slamming moves, something that only specific characters can do in Fighting Vipers, but is available to all characters here. The game places heavy focus on barrier use. Barriers break when struck by heavy attacks, and each fighter has a limited number of barriers per match. Every character can also sacrifice one of their barriers at any time to enter Hyper Mode, which grants them a major increase to their attack speed, as well as the use of powerful new attacks. Most of the characters share a lot of the same basic moves, with a few special techniques to differentiate them. Sonic, of course, focuses on speedy attacks and has a plethora of different spin moves. Tails is a more mid-range fighter, having a few aerial dash moves and attacks that revolve around his twin tails. Knuckles is almost akin to a traditional boxer, although he of course has a gliding attack and can spin dash much like Sonic. Amy is a weapons-based fighter here, and Sonic the Fighters is the game that introduced her iconic Pico Pico hammer. She can slam enemies with it or even throw the hammer around if she feels the need. Fang has his trusty cork gun, which means he much prefers to keep opponents at a distance, although he isn't above an occasional tail slam or donkey kick either. Espio is another mid-range fighter, being able to lash opponents with his long tongue. Bark is a grappler, and in fact is so bulky that he's unable to crouch like the other characters, but his many powerful punches and throws means he can quickly drain any other fighter's health bar in seconds. Bean is probably the most technical of the fighters, with a moveset that prefers throwing around bombs over straight-up fisticuffs. Metal Sonic and Dr. Eggman are only in the game as boss characters, but there is technically a secret 9th playable character. If Sonic can get to the second round against Metal Sonic without incurring a single loss up to that point, he can transform into Super Sonic, essentially a permanent version of Hyper Mode with the added benefit of being completely immune to damage, essentially a reward to the player for their good performance. One of the more controversial mechanics incorporated into Sonic the Fighters was a sort of payback system that scales damage in favor of a losing fighter so that less skilled players will always have a chance to bounce back. Since the game was intended to appeal to more casual players, particularly women and young children, the team wished to ease up on the more hardcore, frame-perfect, skill-intensive playstyles of many competitive fighting games. I could see the payback system being more viable in actual PvP matches, but as for single player, the baseline damage output of attacks is already high enough, and each round's 30-second time limit means that this sort of seesaw damage distribution seems rather pointless, even detrimental. The CPU player tends to spam barriers and grabs, and as well as damage output increasing as characters take more damage, they also tend to grow more desperate, whipping out powerful attacks more often the less health they have. This is especially apparent in the infamous final battle with Metal Sonic, who reaches payback mode sooner than the other characters and has many attacks that ignore barriers. The CPU in this game in general is just really simplistic, and as a result doesn't actually give the player a lot of opportunities to experiment and learn the game's systems. The AI has a tendency to spam, meaning that more often than not, the best way to fight them is to spam whichever one of your moves will get through their spamming. For a genre known for being skill-intensive, Sonic the Fighters almost seems to discourage players from actually playing skillfully. In fact, it seems to outright punish them for it. Aesthetically, though, I really dig Sonic the Fighters. When the game was being developed, Yuji Naka expressed that his major concern with a Sonic-themed fighting game was that the exaggerated rubber hose proportions of the characters would make it awkward to see them throwing punches and kicks. But Yu Suzuki assured him that they had a solution. The characters in Sonic the Fighters are incredibly expressive, with the game utilizing a sort of squash and stretch effect akin to that you'd see in classic American cartoons. Limbs will lengthen and hands and feet will grow several times their size for the sake of pulling off all these crazy fighting moves. Combine that with the game's colorful and lively backgrounds, and Sonic the Fighters often comes off as a living cartoon. The music is also a standout. Composed by AM2 musician Maki Maro, each piece is loud and hectic and heavily melodic. Absolutely perfect for the sort of attention-grabbing vibes an arcade fighter should be aiming for. Each stage, and thus each character essentially, has their own theme, and there's even a unique theme that plays in two-player versus matches if players choose to pit Sonic and Knuckles against each other. 3 tracks go unused, but are included on the game's official soundtrack, those being the Death Egg Hangar, an alternate character select theme, and music for a stage called Sunset Town, which does not exist. Perhaps that would have been the stage for Honey the Cat had she been included in the final game. Sonic the Fighters was decently successful in Japan, being the 13th most popular arcade game in the months following its release. Its distribution in the US, for whatever reason, was very limited. It would be renamed to Sonic Championship in North America, but actually finding a Sonic Championship cabinet out in the wild is like seeing a unicorn. Perhaps Sega of America wasn't as keen on the idea of a Sonic fighting game as Yuji Naka was, but in truth we really don't know why American distribution of the game was so scarce. This is also likely why the game's American title change never really stuck. When the game was finally re-released in 2005, it would retain its Japanese title and has done so ever since. From very early on, a Sega Saturn port of the game was planned and even officially announced as in development. Set for a 1997 release date and later pushed to 1998, this Saturn port never came to be, for reasons never made quite clear. Yojiro Ogawa of Sonic Team has said that they were incapable of recreating the arcade experience on the Saturn. But I think it's also reasonable to assume that by 1998, the Saturn simply wasn't performing well enough outside of Japan to justify a console port of a Sonic game anymore. Sonic and Tails were also not playable in the retail version of Fighting Vipers, although Bean and Bark would be unlockable fighters in Fighters Megamix, a sort of crossover fighting game featuring several existing AM2 characters. Sonic the Fighter's first ever re-release was when it was included in Sonic Gems Collection in 2005 alongside ports of Sonic CD and Sonic R. This was more or less a straight port of the arcade version, although the conversion came with a few performance and lighting issues and slightly longer load times, as well as a 4-frame input delay across the board, which isn't damning by any means for a game as simple as this one, but it's still something worth noting. In 2012, Sonic the Fighters would be released on the PS3 and Xbox 360 online marketplaces as part of the SEGA Model 2 collection, individual re-releases of AM2's trilogy of arcade fighters that also included Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers. This was a fully remastered version of the game that resolved many of the issues of the previous Gems Collection port. It supported online multiplayer and leaderboards, and even finally included Honey the Cat as a secret playable fighter, although she's not allowed in online matches for whatever reason. Even Metal Sonic and Dr. Eggman were made playable, although both of them are treated as overpowered cheat characters and can't be used in the game's single-player mode. Since then, Sonic the Fighters has been included in the Like a Dragon games, formerly known as Yakuza, as a bonus minigame, which even retains Honey and the boss characters as playable fighters, and its inclusion here has further aided in retaining at least some sort of historical relevance for the game. Initial reception to Sonic the Fighters in the 1990s was fairly positive, with critics praising its zany sort of Looney Tunes-esque visual design, but noting that the game was rather simple and would thus likely disappoint hardcore fighting game fans. Reception to the game upon its inclusion in Sonic Gems Collection was noticeably less kind, being dismissed as little more than a dated novelty, and described as a stripped-down Virtua Fighter. The 2012 re-release saw even less praise. Critics noted that it was an interesting, obscure piece of Sega's history, and that its squash and stretch characters were unique even today, but that it was an overall shallow game that lacked the serious competitive potential of other fighting games. Nonetheless, Sonic the Fighters has retained a reputation as something of a cult classic, with the 2012 re-release in particular seeing the game finally gain at least some level of online competitive fandom. The Sonic the Fighters metagame would rapidly evolve in the wake of the game being granted online multiplayer, forming into a small but loyal fanbase and tournament scene. There's actually a great YouTube documentary by a guy named Woostoons about the game's history within the competitive space. I'll link it in the description so you can check it out if you want. While there would never be another Sonic fighter made in this style, another fighting game called Sonic Battle would release on the Game Boy Advance. And Sonic would also eventually become a recurring playable fighter in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. As for Sonic the Fighters, it's overall a short and simple game without a whole lot going on when compared to other games of the genre, but for a game that was essentially thrown together on a whim, it just oozes charm and creativity. And the game's director, Hiroshi Kataoka, who's also current head of SEGA AM2, stated in 2006 that Sonic the Fighters is the game he's personally most proud of. And to me, that seems like a pretty good legacy to leave behind.